It is my pleasure to introduce our moderator for tonight, Leon County Commissioner-elect Kristen Dozier. Kristen has been the Vice President and Green Building Advisor at Mad Dog Construction, where she has worked on the FSU Off-Grid Zero Emission Building and the Urban Green Project. She was President of the Board of Sustainable Tallahassee and is on the board of the Tallahassee Chamber of Commerce. Kristen.
Thank you and good evening. I'm going to introduce our panel. Thank you all for coming tonight. And let each of the panel members have 2 minutes. We do have a timekeeper up front, so you all will see the cards come up. 2-minute introduction about their position on Amendment 4 and what they think I'm sorry, is that better? Thank you for telling me, okay. What they would like to tell us first about Amendment 4 and their position on that. And then we'll take a little time in case you have any response to what you've heard your other panelists talk about. If you don't mind keeping that just relatively short, because I'm sure we'll have a lot of questions from the audience, whether you write them on the cards and I'll read them from the podium, or I'll be walking around, and if you'd like to ask your question yourself, please just raise your hand. And looking forward to a good discussion tonight. So, starting at this end of the table, John Hedrick is the volunteer coordinator for the State Hometown Democracy Campaign. Next to him, we have Joyce Tarnow. See, I knew I was going to stumble over some of the names. Who has volunteered with Hometown Democracy for 7 years, starting in 2003, collecting signatures on her ironing board desk, and now speaks all over North Central Florida on behalf of Amendment 4. Next, actually, you two are in a different position there. Robert Weisert, Director of Communications and External Relations and Special Counsel to the President and CEO of Florida Tax Watch, which is against Amendment 4. Adam Babington, the Vice President of Governmental Affairs for the Florida Chamber of Commerce, which is also against Amendment 4. And at the end, Charles Pattison, President of 1,000 Friends of Florida, which was originally against Amendment 4, but has revised its position to neutral. So we will start our 2-minute introductions with John.
Thank you, Kristen. Good evening, everyone.
You probably need to hold it a little closer, too.
Okay. Morning in Florida. What will it be like on November 3rd? On November 3rd, Floridians will celebrate bright prospects for the Sunshine State if Amendment 4 passes. Or, if Amendment 4 fails, big national home builders and developers will celebrate permanent victory over the protests and rights of Florida citizens, and the bulldozers will be unstoppable. At the polls, you will choose what kind of a morning it will be. You may have heard of lots of false information from the developers about the consequences of passing Amendment 4. The developers Say Anything gang wants to confuse you and to protect the power and profits, and what they're saying has been shown not to be accurate. Let's look now at some of the very real consequences if Amendment 4 does not pass. If the developer forces win and Amendment forces fail, we'll see more of the corruption via campaign contributions and bribes that makes Florida the #1 most politically corrupt state. Our future will be one of continued sprawl, home building, increasing the number of job seekers in the labor force already suffering one of the country's highest unemployment rates. The economy crashed by the developers will continue to be dismal and worse. Agriculture and tourism will be the first to suffer. Without doubt, we'll see an end to Florida's commendable growth management efforts, begun in 1985 and weakened steadily since. Whoever gets into office will merely determine how rapidly this happens. If you've been told that there are better solutions than Amendment 4, don't believe it. Developer influenced politicians have already killed off all those other proposals every time they've come up, and they'll continue to do so. It's their way or the highway. We'll hear more shortly.
Thank you, John. Joyce?
I am a 47-year resident. I'm a 47-year resident of Florida, and I've seen a lot of the state then and now. I do not like the losses we have sustained with ungoverned and unwise developments. If Amendment 4 is not adopted, my new home in north central Florida will look a lot like the Broward County I left behind 3 years ago. There are many refugees like me that have fled the congestion, the spiraling real estate taxes, and deteriorating quality of life. It is not just the disappearance of open space, trees, and wetlands that are of concern. It is a destructive impact on our water supply and the pollution that is still spoiling our rivers and our springs. The reefs off our southeast coast have been abused. Our Gulf Coast, with its white sand beaches, are a treasure that thousands of visitors come to each winter. Tourism is a mainstay of our Florida economy, but it will cease if we are going to be continuing the destruction of these treasures. Economically, our state has been devastated by the titans of development who have compromised so many elected officials. They have cannibalized Florida for mega profits, and they want to continue their control over land use. These titans do not want growth to be managed by long-range plans, plans that take into consideration the infrastructure, needs, and costs to the taxpayers. Instead of developing within the comprehensive plan, they want to go outside the plan. We have been brought to our knees by these titans, and they do not want to let us up. Don't you think we deserve a vote on how our communities develop?
Go ahead, Robert. Thank you, Joyce.
Thank you, and I'm Robert Weissert with Florida Tax Watch, which is a nonpartisan, nonprofit public policy research institute and government watchdog that over our 30-year history has produced independent, non-biased public policy analysis on issues like this and others. Florida Tax Watch has done an analysis on Amendment 4 I want to tell you about briefly tonight, but first off, thank you all for being here. Part of our mission is citizen education, taxpayer value, and government accountability. And government accountability works best when an educated populace gets involved in their government. So we really appreciate seeing places like this and the Village Square and others for putting this on. The Florida Tax Watch analysis, which is available on our website at www.floridataxwatch.org, shows that the likely impact of Amendment 4 will be devastating on jobs, economic activity, personal income, and state and local tax revenues throughout the state of Florida. The numbers specifically that were analyzed by a research team from the Haas Center at the University of West Florida, and that analysis was independently juried by an economist from Florida State University and one from Barry University, show that it could cost more than 260,000 jobs, $16 billion in personal income, $21 billion in state gross product, and more than $227 million in local property taxes, about $3.4 million per county throughout the state of Florida. According to the analysis, the passage of Amendment 4 would be devastating, especially given Florida's current economic and fiscal condition. Given this analysis, instead of risking the hundreds of thousands of jobs and putting in jeopardy Florida's economic recovery by marking up the Constitution through Amendment 4, Florida Tax Watch believes we should instead focus on making improvements to existing growth management laws that exist throughout the state that promote healthy investment in the state of Florida and will make us competitive for the 21st century. Again, thank you for being here, and I hope you listen to all sides.
Thank you, Robert. Adam, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Good evening. And again, I want to reiterate what we just heard from Robert about the importance of all of you being here tonight, the importance of having this debate. I know a lot of you raised your hands saying that you'd already made up your mind, but for those of you who are still undecided, hopefully you'll hear something that's presented tonight that resonates with you. You've heard from the proponents of this amendment all of the horrible things that could happen if their amendment doesn't pass. And really, let's talk about what this amendment would do, because we didn't hear a whole lot about how this amendment would work. This amendment would require voters to approve every single change to a local government's comprehensive plan. Every single change. Large-scale amendments, small-scale amendments, technical amendments, every change would have to be approved by the voters. A lot of people think about that and ask, well, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with voting? You think about the amount of amendments that could occur over a course of a year or 2 years. when a local government such as Leon County or City of Tallahassee is trying to preserve more green space, is trying to update their plan to comply with state law. The number of amendments could range into dozens, if not hundreds. That could lead to extensive amounts of additional costs that supervisors of elections will have to incur. I think you'll hear Robert talk a little bit about their estimate that it will cost between $40 and $80 million just to conduct the elections to comply with Amendment 4 in the state of Florida. The litigation that would ensue after you've had voters come in and vote on each one of these amendments would reach over $1 billion. This has already been tried in Florida in St. Pete Beach. It has failed there. Hopefully we'll be able to talk a little bit more about that later on today. But the speculation about what this amendment would do and what it would not do as far as the proponents go doesn't hold up to the facts, because we've seen this tried in the state of Florida. It hasn't worked, and it won't work if we put it in the state's constitution. Thank you.
Thank you. And Charles.
Good evening. I'm in the position of advocating a neutral position. I want to explain how we came from not supporting Amendment 4 to that change. Our board, as you probably know, did not support the amendment for the first couple of years, but we made a choice to look at the results of the recent 2010 session before making a final judgment. To be honest, we were very disappointed with what we saw and what we didn't see. We've heard a lot about everybody seems to agree that growth management needs to be adjusted, needs to be fixed. We're one of the few organizations that have been trying to improve citizen access, citizen standing for the last 3 years in the session and gotten nowhere. We agree that the changes are needed, but seeing the lack of interest in the legislature for something that we had labeled a Citizen Planning Bill of Rights that was designed to help protect citizen standing, protect citizens from slap suits, have a mandatory supermajority vote for all plan amendments. None of that got any attention. So my board was interested in sending some kind of message that the status quo cannot be continued. Whatever else happens, we think that has got to change. We have tried to do that without success so far. We realize there are good people on both sides of this argument. We recognize the pros and cons. We've just advised our supporters to go to our website to look for our statement of September 13th, and you can see how we went through the issues. We do believe this is an important event for Florida's future, and we do urge you to listen and vote carefully.
All right, thank you all very much. And as promised, we'll start back with John and Joyce. If you all have a few minutes response to what you've just heard, that would be just fine. Would one of you like to start?
I've got a true or false statement or question for the audience. True or false? Florida Tax Watch is an impartial, unbiased think tank. Let me tell you some of the people that are on the board of Florida Tax Watch. Holland & Knight, AT&T, Verizon, Prudential Financial, Public Supermarkets, U.S. Sugar Corporation, Greenberg Traurig, SunTrust, Walt Disney World Resort, Post-Tuck, Buckley, Shoe, and Jernigan. I submit to you that the phony economic impact statement that Florida Tax Watch put out is guy go in and guy go out. They are not impartial. They are slanted. What they have put out to the public is shameful because it is all distortion and untruths.
All right, Robert, I think I'll let you go next on that
Well,
one.
thank you. I may have a bit of response to that. Obviously, those great corporate citizens that are board members of Florida Tax Watch, we appreciate their contribution. We appreciate they've chosen to give back to their communities and to their state by supporting Florida Tax Watch, which has never gone along with what the board determines we do. We are an independent research organization that lets the facts determine our outcomes and publishes our reports without checking with our board of directors or our executive committee. For 30 years, we've operated in this independent manner, and that's the reason why Florida Tax Watch has retained its credibility. This analysis in particular, actually Florida Tax Watch has done two on this issue, a briefing with the fiscal impact that Adam mentioned, but the economic impact, I encourage everyone to go to the website, www.floridataxwatch.org, and check out for yourself. We also have a few copies here. It's about 70 pages long. That was conducted by University of West Florida. I don't know what their board of directors is, but I highly doubt that any of those names that were just listed sit on that, because that's a state research institute. This report was also juried by an economist from Florida State University, Dr. Stephan Norbin, and an economist from Barry University, Dr. Stephen Morrell. And I certainly know that neither of those institutions have anyone on their board who would feel one way or the other. So I don't feel that has any basis, but certainly we respect all of our members throughout the state, which range from small businesses, individual members, retirees, snowbirds, and some large corporations, a few of whom sit on the board, and we appreciate their dedication to the state and their contribution as good corporate citizens.
All right, thank you. John, Adam, did either of you have a response?
To that or overall?
Or overall, yes.
Overall?
We can move off
Well-
that topic, yes.
Well, okay. Well, conveniently, as I mentioned earlier, the other side has come up with no solutions. That's what is going to be continuing to be the case. You're not going to hear any solutions coming from the other side because they like things just as it is, and that's why we've gotten here with Amendment 4, because there's been every solution has been shot down previously, and here's where we are with it. And I might add, Amendment 4 has been working just fine in Yankeetown. You don't hear the other side talking about that, but that's an example of it working just great. And as far as St. Pete Beach is concerned, just briefly, that's not Amendment 4 there. The part that was, anything that's passed under Amendment 4 at St. Pete Beach like that has had no litigation, versus those things that skipped all the parts of the regular comprehensive planning process did have litigation. So that's all I want to say at this point.
All right. Thank you, John. Adam?
Sure, I'd like to address a couple of those issues. Let's start with the St. Pete Beach issue, because St. Pete Beach was the model of how Amendment 4 would work until they realized that it was a disaster. And this isn't the Florida Chamber that's saying that St. Pete Beach is an example of Amendment 4. This is the St. Pete Times that opposes Amendment 4, and they pointed specifically to what's going on in St. Pete Beach and said it hasn't worked there, it won't work in the rest of the state of Florida. But I think what you heard in part of the discussion earlier was an attack on those of us who oppose Amendment 4. Rather than defending the merits of this amendment, rather than talking about how good this amendment could possibly be for the state of Florida, what we've heard time and time again is attacking the groups that oppose it. There are over 300 organizations across the state of Florida that have come out in opposition to Amendment 4, from business groups to local governments to unions to Habitat for Humanity. All of these groups agree on almost nothing besides the fact that Amendment 4 will be bad for our state. And we hear the argument that, well, there aren't any alternatives proposed. Unfortunately, with a constitutional amendment, you can't go in and fix it. There are no glitch bills in proposing constitutional amendments. We had a small group of special interest lawyers write an amendment to Florida's Constitution and come out and try to put it onto the ballot, into the Constitution. And there's no opportunity for public input. There's no opportunity to amend it. It's so extreme that it applies to everything. So there aren't any exceptions for churches or schools or parks. This is why Amendment 4 won't work, and this is why you see the other side resort to these tactics, because fundamentally this amendment is flawed.
Just one thing. We were concerned about the idea of what a comprehensive plan is. Every local government has a comprehensive plan that has a 10-year or 20-year planning horizon that's supposed to guide all growth and development. Why do we see more and more amendments coming every year? DCA's processed more amendments in the last 3 years than they've ever done because of the fear of Amendment 4. Currently, there's a vacant housing inventory, 300,000 to 400,000 dwelling units. DCA, with local government's urging, has approved another 600,000 dwelling units and over a billion square feet of commercial and institutional space that has nothing now to hold it back. It can be built tomorrow. Why isn't it being built? Because it can't be financed. We really question whether or not those kind of economic consequences are before us right now.
All right, thank you all very much. I have one submitted question so far. If anyone else has one, you can hold it up. I'll come around. And if you'd like to ask a question yourself, please raise your hand and I'll make my way around the room. And I'll start with this one and then I'll come right around there. And for you all, anyone who would like to answer, just let me know. This one comes from the construction industry. If Amendment 4 does not pass, how can the citizens of Florida have controls over runaway development of Florida? Would anybody like to?
Well, I would say that Florida Tax Watch already has control over, that Florida already has control over development.
Nice.
Florida has in place the republic system that was set up by our founders. The idea of our local officials who are elected according to the United States Constitution, which for 220 years has governed our nation, and has set up a republic democracy where we elect elected officials and they represent us on our behalf to twice a year consider comp plan amendments instead of taking everything through referendum. This isn't the right way to do it, to mark up Florida's Constitution and undermine the principles of Republican democracy. Our elected officials are, especially local elected officials, are sympathetic to the electorate and what they want. We have here in this room a couple of elected officials with us. Commissioner Ziffer is here, and obviously Commissioner Dozier is here, and would never want to let pass that Representative Michelle Rowinkel-Vasselinda is also here, but local elected officials are already our check on these things. We have the comprehensive amendment, or the comprehensive plan that Charles mentioned, and to make amendments to it, the commission has to vote on it. And if they vote to approve it, then that's how it gets approved. And if they don't act in our best interest, then we vote them out. It's the institutional check that's coming up this Tuesday. It's an election. It happens all the time, and if they don't represent our interest, we throw them out. And that's really what we should be focused on doing, not marking up Florida's Constitution as an overreaction to a couple of counties where some bad things may have happened.
All right.
When our elected
Joyce?
officials no longer represent us, the people have a right to take back this decision-making that so much impacts on their lives and their communities. Let me remind you that from 1998 to 2007, Florida had 824 convicted public officials. And there are a lot more that are under indictment now. So for you to say that we can trust our elected officials, that's baloney. Oh, and about the special interest lawyers, Leslie Blackner, a Palm Beach environmental attorney, started this whole process of Florida Hometown Democracy. She has spent 7 years of her life, a lot of her income, to push for something that she thought needed to be done to save the Florida that she grew up in and loved. As far as special interest, I read to you the people who are the special interests. They're the construction industry. They're the lawyers that represent the developers. We don't have a chance against the big money people that are throwing everything against us in this campaign. Since 2007, our opposition has raised $12 million. We have gathered a little over $2 million in order to try to put this before the people of Florida so they would have a vote on how their communities develop. St. Pete Beach was a situation where the developers got the commission to pass something that would take off the 5-story height limit on St. Pete Beach, triple the density, and there was no public hearing or notification to those people. Of course they sued. You would do that too. But we need to have our own vote. We need a seat at the table. Florida Hometown Democracy is the David against the Goliath. When you see over $4 million put into the opposition by the Florida Association of Realtors, and you see people that have gotten stimulus money in the billions of dollars putting thousands and thousands of dollars into our opposition, follow the money. They don't want the game changed. They don't want you to have a vote. If you want to have some control over land use, if you don't want a mining operation or an incinerator in your community, you should have the right to vote on that.
Thank you. Charles?
Just a real quick example. I'm surprised we haven't heard about the city of Sarasota. It's a charter city. They voted to have a supermajority requirement to move their urban service boundary as an example, and that is the kind of selective citizen enforcement we thought was more appropriate than the broad-based Amendment 4. There are other examples, but I'm not aware that that's ever been an issue for that community.
Thank you. All right. We'll take a question from the audience now. Would you like to stand up? Okay. And if you all will introduce yourself when you ask a question.
My name's Jim Cruz, and I'm a former elected official, so I guess I don't have much credibility with at least one member of the group. I have a question for Charles. 1,000 Friends is neutral. I also think aren't you a former division director with community affairs over comprehensive planning? I'm confused about what we would be voting on if the amendment did pass. There are hundreds of rezonings, there are dozens of land use changes. What are the logistics of this? What are we voting on?
I'll give you my impression. I think that's one of the questions. It's not crystal clear. We see it as a vote on any change to the land use comprehensive plan itself. I've heard the supporters of Amendment 4 say no, it would only apply to the land use elements themselves, but we would take the position that any development that's going to be approved in a community has got to be consistent with the entire comprehensive plan, meaning that any change in any of the elements of the comprehensive plan we believe would require a public vote if Amendment 4 passed.
All right, thank you. And another question from the floor? Would you like to- Oh, I'm sorry.
I don't know. Go ahead.
Okay, since it was directed towards Charles.
I would still like to follow up, if I could, on his question before I get to mine. You talk about any elements of the plan, but I'm not sure what that means. A rezoning request? Is that what requires an amendment to the comprehensive plan?
It's, well, there's no single answer because every community's land use plan and their categories are different. But if you try to propose development that's not allowed in the land use district, whether it's agriculture, residential, commercial, institutional, you can petition for an amendment to allow whatever it is that you're asking for. It would not include a rezoning, for example. It's only the plan amendment process itself that would trigger that public vote.
And I'll follow up on that a little bit. Comprehensive plans, as a result of state requirements, have multiple elements included. So whether it has to do with water or conservation or economic development, all of these elements are contained in the comprehensive plan. And so it isn't just developments. I know we keep going back to this issue of developments, but this could very well just be an issue where, and this happened in Leon County, you have a single-family home on a half-acre parcel that over the years has been started to be surrounded by commercial development. And this single-family homeowner, in order to have the opportunity to sell their property, wants to change their land use designation from residential to commercial to conform with the existing uses surrounding that property. The road in front of their house has gone from a 2-lane to a 6-lane. If this amendment passes, all of the voters in Leon County would have the opportunity to vote on whether that single-family homeowner could change their land use designation to conform with the surrounding property. That's what this amendment would be. And it would have consequences beyond just that homeowner. For every amendment, for every change, neighborhood against neighborhood, big and small issues, all of these issues would have to be addressed via referendum.
And there's about 8,000 comp plan amendments per year in the state of Florida.
Don't we agree that's too many already? That's part of the reason this has all happened. And the fact of the matter is there's been studies done by the Department of Community Affairs that every year there would only be approximately 4.2 votes. You've got to go as the ordinance goes. For example, here in Leon County, each year, you may recall, the city and county government passes through their through the process one ordinance. There would only in Leon County be 2 ordinances for the county and 2 ordinances for the city to vote on each year as citizens. Okay, so to give a very concrete. And yes, we've already said we do believe it is limited just to the land use element, the text and the map, and potentially those things that directly impact land use. Okay, so it's a lot more narrow than just voting on the entire comprehensive plan. And those numbers, I might add, are numbers that are the entire plans now. So the idea is to have less changes. After all, do we want a plan? We don't want to have something that can be amended like Swiss cheese.
Adam, very quickly.
Yeah, we hear this a lot from the proponents of this where they like to redefine what their amendment says. Let me read the amendment to you. Before a local government may adopt a new comprehensive land use plan or amend a comprehensive land use plan, such proposed plan or plan amendment shall be subject to a vote of the electors of the local government by referendum. That means that every single one of these changes has to be voted on individually. If you have an entire package of amendments that go through a local government, they may be able to pass it by ordinance. But you can't do that via referendum. You cannot ask the voters to vote on 50 or 60 separate items in one amendment because Florida, by law, limits amendments to a 15-word ballot title and a 75-word summary. So to explain dozens, if not hundreds, of changes to a comprehensive plan in 15-word ballot title and 75-word summary would not give voters sufficient information. So each one of these would have to be voted on individually.
No,
All right, this is an important issue, so John, real quickly if you can, but we've got a number of other questions already.
I know. It's permissible under law to do it the way we're talking about. Now, if the government want to start playing games and pass zillions of ordinances that people would want to do, you have to look at who's playing the game with that, number one. Number two, the citizens are going to be you note that right now there is not in statute what's known as a comprehensive land use plan. This will constitutionalize part of the land use planning process to put it beyond the reach of the legislature and the local governments. That's the whole idea. So they can't turn around and amend it away willy-nilly.
Thank you. All right, one more question.
Hi, I'm Rich Robledo. My field is not relevant to the topic. Anyway, Adam, you had mentioned earlier that you didn't hear any reason to vote for it. You just heard criticisms of the opponents. And you also, it seems to me what I've heard from the opponents has been all economic issues. Is the opposition strictly economic? You also mentioned that this has failed miserably in St. Pete. Can you explain what you meant by it's failed? How do you define failure in St. Pete?
Sure. Well, let's talk about. We have talked about the economic effects, and that's a pretty big deal when Florida has 11.9% unemployment, and we have seen multiple economic studies saying why this is a bad amendment, but no economic studies showing why this is a good idea. The other issues really comes down to the workability and the confusion and the lawsuits that come as a result of passing this amendment, of asking voters to navigate these 15-word ballot title and 75-word summaries on information that they may not necessarily have at their fingertips. For those of you who were looking in your Sunday paper back a couple weeks ago, and I'm sorry for those of you listening on the radio because this doesn't make for good radio, but there was, on the second page, there's 6 local charter amendments that were on the inside page of an inside section. That's all the information that most voters are going to get on voting on their local charter amendments, and that's probably all they would get if they voted on each one of these comp plan amendments, unless they take the time to go find a website to try to inform themselves on what exactly these things do. I talk about the time it would take for voters to navigate these ballots, of the cost that local governments would incur by sending these ballots to absentee ballots, to overseas voters. You talk about the lawsuits that will result over the writing of the ballot titles and summaries and what the voters decided. And that leads directly to your question about St. Pete Beach, because it's really important to understand what happened there. In 2006, the voters in St. Pete Beach were told many of the same things that we're hearing today from the proponents of Amendment 4. This just gives you a voice in local government. This puts you back in control. So the voters there agreed. They put it in their local charter. By 2008, a series of amendments had been proposed, approved by the local government, and put before the voters. The voters there approved all of those amendments by more than 50%, good substantial margins. Within 24 hours, a series of lawsuits and administrative challenges were filed against the results of that election. It was all about trusting the voters until the voters did something that the proponents of Amendment 4 didn't like. So we saw one of the lawsuits that was filed by one of the co-founders of Amendment 4 himself. Within a year, the local government had incurred over $500,000 in legal fees just fighting off these lawsuits. By September of 2009, the local government there raised property taxes to offset their litigation losses. And in November of 2009, a year ago today, or this month, we saw the local voters in St. Pete Beach say, enough is enough, this isn't working, and they receded from what they had put in their local charter and modified their amendment so they wouldn't be voting on everything. That's the story of St. Pete Beach. That is the situation that we want to avoid statewide.
All right, thank you. John, did you want to?
Well, again, I mean, Joyce made the point for us already that those amendments that he's talking about that were passed, none of the process was followed before they went to the voters. All Amendment 4 is, would you conduct the exact same processes we do before, and then it would go to the citizens' vote. The citizens would have a veto, basically. And a lot of people on the other side of the fence think, that just means, the citizens are going to vote everything down. That's not true. We know here, for example, in Tallahassee, Tallahasseans were given the chance to vote on a coal plant. They passed it. Whether or not you like that or not, that's what they did, okay? They're likewise. But, it's to stop abuses like having $500 million of your taxpayer money spent on an unnecessary airport in Bay County where the citizens voted it down, and because Amendment 4 was not in place, They rolled it on through, and that's money that comes right out of your pocket, and I might add, that's where a lot of their campaign monies are coming from, a bailout of the home builders industry that gives money right back to them is getting funneled right back into their campaign against this. How convenient.
All right, we have another question, and then I'll read a couple for us.
Okay. Gil Ziff, I'm a Tallahassee City Commissioner. And has anybody noticed there's a chilling effect in here? It's a bit cold. That was not planned.
Yeah, actually, to interrupt, we're working on it.
Okay. I have a question, but before I ask that question, I would appreciate it, and I'm going to not direct this at either side, but I'm looking for honest, straightforward, direct answers about the process. I'm not really concerned about who's evil and who's not evil. My concern is if you look at our current political situation, and I think all of us are sick and tired, we're ready for this particular election cycle to be done. I think that's probably accurate because we're tired of the accusation here and accusation there, and we're really not getting to the facts. Would both sides, whomever, I don't care, just explain the process if, let's say, over a period of, and you designate the time, there are 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 comp plan amendments proposed, what the process is over a period of, let's say, 2 years that would occur, at which point then the voters finally get to vote. In other words, is this going to be every 3 months we're going to have an election, every 6 months? Does it happen once a year? What would be a good thing to do? What would be a bad way to go? I'm hearing a lot of accusations. I just want to know what's the process. I think I know what it is, but I'm not sure if everybody here does.
It's a very simple process. The same process that is in place now for putting in an amendment request would still be the same. It would go through the local elected officials, go through DCA, come back to local elected officials. And the extra step would be it would have to go on a ballot at the next general election, not a special election. And therefore, we wouldn't have these millions of dollars in extra funds that the opposition says would have to be spent for elections. So what it does is it gives people final control. It doesn't mean that someplace like Sarasota is protected and the rest of the state is not protected. This amendment is statewide. If it passes, every community in Florida that's been fighting against officials who don't listen to them, who don't want what the community wants for themselves, will have an opportunity to have a vote. We deserve a seat at the table. The current system has crashed our economy. We have 300,000 empty housing units now, and yet they still want to amend for more and more raw land to be taken into development. There would be no vote if they built within the current comp plan that guides growth in a community. So where is this coming from? It's coming from the mega profit motivation.
Adam?
I agreed with Joyce up until the point where she said at the next general election, because it doesn't say that in the amendment, and there's nothing that provides in current law for how these amendments, how these referenda will be conducted. That is one of the points of contention, is that the existing process would remain the same up until the point where the local government approves it and says, okay, it's now time for the voters to decide. Now, you could have a special election, you could have elections twice a year, you could have it every 2 years, but one of the problems that you run into is that there are state-required comp plan amendments that have to go through on an annual basis. And so to sit back and say, well, every 2 years we're going to approve 2 years' worth of comp plan amendments, that's probably not practical because of the number of amendments that you would then end up having stacked up waiting for voter approval. So then you have a question of, okay, well, how often do you have other elections? Do you have it annually? Do it every 6 months? That hasn't been resolved. It isn't in this amendment. It isn't in the text of the amendment. So someone would have to figure that out, whether it's the legislature or whether it's litigation that would ensue, because a supervisor of elections would have to try to figure out what they're supposed to do with these amendments. That's an unclear question, and it won't be resolved probably for quite some time if this amendment were to pass.
Charles?
Just a quick point of clarification. The public only votes if the elected official transmits or approves the amendment. The elected officials, of course, can still deny it. But to be honest, one of the concerns that we had for Amendment 4 would be a very logical thing for an elected official to do, I believe, would be to say, look, I'm going to duck, I'm going to not take the heat on this, I'm going to send it out to the public, I'm going to vote for it just to find out what the public thinks and then we'll move forward.
Thank you. Okay.
Well, there's no...
Go ahead, John.
If there is a desire to have elections sooner, let the developer or applicant pay for it, A. B, the fact of the matter is, wouldn't you like to have some control over that legislature? First off, a lot of these things they're going to be proposing the legislature, you're not going to be voting on anyway because it only is going to deal with land use or things directly pertinent to it. But let's assume for purposes of argument the legislature does try and change some statute that deals with land use. Well, hey, the Constitution's going to trump the statute. So the citizens of the local area, if they don't like what the legislature's doing, could vote that amendment down and it would hold up. How's that for a nice change of pace?
All right. I've got two questions that I'll read that were submitted by the audience, and I apologize to Linda, who just left before her question was read. Her question wasn't directed towards anybody in particular, but she asked, isn't it true that current local land use plans around the state would allow 100 million Florida residents? How can it be said that Amendment 4 is anti-growth, if that is true?
I'm going to start. That's a tough question to answer because nobody knows for sure how much development is authorized in the existing comprehensive plans. The last time it was even done, there was a rough approximation in the middle 90s, and I think the range of population figures that it could be accommodated if the land use plans were all built out was something on the order, this would have been by 2030, somewhere between 36 million and maybe 90 million people. There are a lot of reasons why it would be not that big, but no one has tried to take the current land use plans in Florida and add them up to see what we would get.
That figure of 101 million was from a study that was done, requested of the DCA by the executive director of the Southwest Florida Regional Planning Center, and it was published in the Tampa Tribune. It was 101 million at that time. We are now approaching 19 million in the state. We have water shortages. We have a lot of things that should be considered before we go willy-nilly increasing densities throughout our state. In fact, Dr. Richard Rubino, a professor emeritus here at Florida State University, and Dr. Earl Starnes, a professor emeritus of planning at Florida State University, co-wrote a book called The History of Planning in Florida. Both of these individuals, Dr. Earl Starnes and Dr. Richard Rubino, have endorsed Amendment 4 because the Growth Management Act that was supposedly a stellar accomplishment in 1985 has been known more for not being utilized. It's had more abuse than implementation. So the thing that we have to worry about is, who do you trust? Do you trust the elected officials? Do you think that you could replace a bad apple every election cycle? What do you do about the bad plans that already went through? What do you do about a St. Joe project that used all this federal money, got approvals from the Federal Aviation Administration, the Army Corps of Engineers, and built an airport on wetlands in spite of a 53% straw vote by the people in that county, Bay County, that did not want this? We've got to take the power away from all these people who don't care about the future of Florida, about our communities, and about the grandchildren we'd like to see have the Florida that we've enjoyed.
Adam?
Yeah, that number is one that we've heard over the last couple of years, and it's the big scary number of, oh, if we don't pass Amendment 4, then that's what's going to happen. And realistically, what Amendment 4 would do would be prohibiting smarter growth approaches. And 1,000 Friends of Florida pointed out a couple of years ago that said that if you do impose Amendment 4 on these communities, you'll actually encourage sprawl. You'll push development out into undeveloped areas because of the difficulty that developers and businesses will have in expanding in existing areas. That's just a nature of supply and demand, that once you start putting restrictions on already developed areas, it's going to move towards where there's already available density. So if you're afraid of that big number that they're throwing around, the worst thing that you can do is pass Amendment 4, because it will actually encourage and speed up the process of filling in those undeveloped areas. But the other part of what we just heard about in terms of elected officials and getting involved in local government, We have a process right now that it's actually been happening over the last month, but next Tuesday you have the opportunity to vote people out. And it looks like from the mood of the electorate, a lot of people are going to get voted out. Some already have. That's the process of democracy. That is the level of involvement that people grasp, and it's showing up to events like this. But unfortunately, not all voters have the time or the patience to be attending hour-and-a-half meetings on one constitutional amendment, or going and finding out everything they can about every single comp plan amendment that's being proposed by a local government. That's why we have elected officials who represent their constituents. And when they stop doing the will of the voters, when they stop representing them adequately, they get voted out like they're doing in large numbers right now. And that is the process that we've had in place. And rather than throwing out the process and then putting voters in a position where they're having to analyze each one of these comp plan amendments individually, we should encourage more voter involvement and citizen participation in evaluating their current elected officials' performance.
John?
And part of the problem is with the existing campaign contribution system, too many elected officials are, quite obviously, beholden to the development industry. You can get rid of somebody, but somebody comes right behind them and does a lot of the same thing. That's been the problem we've had in Florida for a long period of time, and that's why the citizens have chosen to use the initiative process to put this Amendment 4 out there so we can try and rein this in. I mean, if we want to have a discussion about public financing, that's for another whole day. But the fact, so we can get out from under that piece of this too. But in the meantime, you've got an Amendment 4 which will protect you from your taxes and fees going up before it happens rather than after the fact, because development doesn't pay for itself.
I want to piggyback on what Adam said in response to that. The Florida Tax Watch analysis conducted by the University of West Florida shows similar things, that according to literature and other best guess analysis, that it could decrease affordable housing and actually result in sprawl, which is one of the things that Amendment 4 purports to be opposed to. And the reason is, as Adam said, urban areas are least likely to approve these comprehensive plan changes, and affordable housing things would be the least likely to get the support because they would lack the public knowledge on these specific issues. And I'm still, I again agree with Adam, putting aside the fiscal analysis, that the representative democracy is really what's under attack here now, and our local officials as well. And I don't understand the undermining of that in the argument that voters can't be trusted to elect competent elected officials who act in their best interest, but they can be trusted to analyze extraordinarily complicated comprehensive plan amendments. I mean, just to try to analyze what would happen to an entire statewide amendment, we used 73 pages and 7 economists to try to come up with the best we could do as the most likely scenario. We're talking about up to Duval County had 67 comp plan amendments last year alone. There's almost 8,000 throughout the state of Florida. We're talking about incredibly complex, comprehensive things for people, for anyone, to analyze them on an individual level, not just the citizen to educate themselves on it, but for people to figure out what is going to be the effect of this comp plan, and here's how we'll explain it to you. I think that's a lot to ask, and that's why the Republican form of democracy, the representative form of democracy, has survived and served our country so well for so long.
Charles?
Very briefly,
yes.
Kristen, this to me represents the dilemma that Amendment 4 presents. You can look at the same set of facts and get a completely contrary position. I think the positive side of what Amendment 4 would do would be to force development of the very areas that have already been approved. They don't need additional plan amendments. There's no need to vote on them. All they need is a building permit and financing. I think that's probably the most likely result, that if it is more difficult to get a plan amendment, then people are going to go to the areas that are already authorized for development, and we've got plenty of that, as you've heard.
All right, the next question I have is, thank you all, is directed towards John and Joyce. If Amendment 4 passes, what cost to Floridians in terms of jobs, personal income, state tax revenue, property taxes, and election referenda do you project annually? What study of these factors can you point to support your position?
How about none? And the Soskin report from the University of Central Florida, which basically said theirs was garbage, is what we would go to. Real easy. We don't need to go down that trail. They're projecting what happened before the bubble burst. Okay? They crashed the economy. We don't even have 4 in effect, and we're in a bad shape because they crash the economy. That's going to continue. And for this business also to hit one other point that's just came, they said, urban sprawl, you're going to have to approve comprehensive plan amendments to do that, to push things out. And a 4, of course, will allow people to vote on that too. And by the way, there's a new paradigm that's now starting to come in. The old paradigm said, okay, you build more densely, you build more intensely, you avoid having problems with your rural areas. But the problem is, the new paradigm is we're getting beyond in Florida carrying capacity. That's a new paradigm that isn't really taken into account very well in a lot of the planning processes, that we no longer have the water or the other resources for this. That's increasingly happening, obviously, down south more than it has up here, but it's going to happen up here because people are moving this direction.
The recent Florida Tax Watch report, the recent report, this is any other report that was referenced there is not the Florida Tax Watch report conducted by the Haas Center and the University of West Florida, but the recent report showed specifically to those more than 200,000 jobs, more than $16 billion in income, more than $20 billion in the state gross product, and a different Florida Tax Watch report, not conducted by the University of West Florida, but internally based on consensus estimating conference numbers and other issues, came, as Adam said, $40 to $80 million for the direct fiscal impact, and then hundreds of millions, if not $1 billion, for the litigation costs. Those are based on St. Pete Beach, where we've seen it. No full state has done it, so all of these are what Florida Tax Watch and what our university's economists determined to be the most likely outcome. No one can tell you for sure what will happen under Amendment 4. We don't purport to, we wouldn't purport to, that wouldn't be accurate. We can tell you that people with a lot of experience and a lot of education on these issues look at it and tell you the most likely scenario is devastating on jobs, devastating on the economy, and expensive for fiscal issues, and who wants to use your tax dollars to pay for lawyers.
Our current economy was crashed by the development and banking industries. We have 11.5% unemployment now. We have all this overbuilding that is on the plans now that we may never be able to carry out because of water situations, energy demands, that kind of thing. But the system we have now was caused by what you're proposing to continue.
I have a lot more faith in Floridians.
If St. Pete Times put in a story 2 days ago from PolitiFact that your economic study just is not to be relied upon.
That is utterly untrue. The St. Pete Times was talking about a different study by the Washington Economics Group. They did not say it was untrue. They said because the Washington Economics Group said that they could accurately to the dollar predict the outcome, that it was barely true. The Florida Tax Watch study has not been disputed by the St. Pete Times in any way. It has not been addressed by the St. Pete Times, and it's not just a Florida Tax Watch study. It was done by University of West Florida, Florida State, Barry University. And I have a lot more faith in Floridians than that. I have a lot more faith in our elected officials. I have a lot more faith in representative democracy.
I might just say that PolitiFact relied on 2 economists that already taken a position against Amendment 4, so that already threw their credibility into doubt, even saying it's barely true. It should have said pants on fire, it was untrue.
All right. One very quick question, and Charles, you may be the best person to answer this, although I'm sure all of you could. Every county in Florida has a comprehensive plan? Yes?
Yes.
No?
Every county, every city required by state law.
Okay. And I think you referenced earlier that they're used in slightly different ways in different respective counties.
Well,
is that true?
the dilemma, and that was why you can't really give an answer on how much development is authorized, is the way Leon County defines agriculture or residential density is different than the way Miami-Dade does it, and that's different than the way Putnam County does it, and that's different than the way Escambia County does it. Those estimates were rough estimates that they tried to translate the different allowances.
Okay. Well, we'll go to one more quick question before we wrap up with this segment. How do other states deal with this problem? Anyone?
Well, no state has done something like Amendment 4, not on a statewide level.
What about the issue of land use in general? Do they have comprehensive plans, or do they have a different approach?
Different states have different comprehensive planning requirements. Florida's is one of the most comprehensive. State of Oregon, state of Washington have somewhat similar comprehensive plans. California doesn't have direct mandatory statewide planning, but you see a lot of city and incorporated charter movements that regulate land use. I know a lot of people are concerned that we might follow the the California model in doing that, and then you have a disjointed, a system where what's required in one community is different than what's required in the next, and makes it very difficult to know what the right thing to do is.
Well, all states certainly do one thing. They have elections where people vote for elected officials at the local level, at the county level, and at the state level. That's been working throughout the United States, all 50 states, every county, every community, and the entire country. So that much I can tell you, that's part of their process.
Okay, we're going to wrap up for our radio audience in just a moment, and so Charles, this question was directed towards you, if you could answer it in a minute. Describe the Sarasota model you mentioned earlier. Is there a really brief description of how that differed from St. Pete?
Well, first of all, it's a city charter amendment. Adam mentioned the ones that Leon County is looking at. That was a citizen initiative, as I understand it, placed it on the ballot. Their citizens felt that the urban boundary was a key issue in their planning considerations, and they voted it in. The interesting thing to me is that they haven't had to ever use that. They've had unanimous votes either to approve or unanimous votes to reject requests to expand their boundaries.
Okay, thank you, Charles. That will have to be the last word for the first portion of our program. We'd like to thank our panel on Amendment 4, John Hedrick, Joyce Tarnow. I wrote the wrong last name, actually, but I corrected myself. Robert Weissert, Adam Babington, and Charles Patterson, and of course, our moderator, Kristen Dozier. We will continue our discussion of hometown democracy with our audience after we say goodbye to our listeners on WFSU's radio broadcast. We'd like to thank Collins Center for Public Policy for making our broadcast possible tonight. This was recorded live at St. John's Episcopal Church in downtown Tallahassee. The Village Square is committed to civil and constructive public dialogue on the issues that matter to our community and our state. Find us online at www.tothevillagesquare.org. Thanks for joining us, and good night.